Good morning, and well, nice to be back again. Thank you to Arlindo for inviting me to the show. Today I actually get to give my own talk, which is nice, a little bit less stressful, once that goes away. So, given the nature of diving talks, Arlindo asked me to put together something that might inspire some questions and some talks later on during the day. Many of the sites that we all dive are shipwrecks. They may be wrecks of aircraft, of ships, and with these, nearly always, when those wrecks sunk, somebody passed away, went down with those wrecks, so effectively these sites become graves. And what I really wanted to talk about this morning was honoring the fallen by respecting those sites appropriately. So I put together a little medley of some projects I've been involved with that have these scenarios to take into consideration and processes we use to be respectful to the fallen. Sometimes you dive sites where it's fairly obvious you will find remains. Modern sites like World War I wrecks, World War II wrecks. Other times you find remains in the least expected place. This set of remains is the only images in the entire presentation of any remains, and that's because they're from 200 BC. These were found by accident. The Antikythera wreck is not really a wreck as such, it's a wreck site. It's off the coast of a very small island between the Greek mainland and Crete, and it was made famous by the fact that one of the artifacts found on it in 1901 by Greek sponge divers who were sheltering from a storm and decided to try to look for sponges on the site where they could shelter, and the first diver went down and came up immediately saying there were bodies everywhere. He was kind of right, but those bodies were bronze statues and marble statues that mostly are now all held in the Museum of Archaeology in Athens. Cousteau dived this site in the 70s. One of his episodes was about it. They excavated the site extensively. It spreads from around 40 meters down to 70 on a slope in a heavily earthquake-prone zone. So I returned there with Dr. Brendan Foley, from, at the time, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. In the 90s and into the 2000s, we were there for 7 years, most years 2-season projects of 1 to 2 months each. And the aim was to start to excavate the site, which is basically a 2,000-year-old pile of debris that has fallen onto the shelf, and the wreck is buried within it. At that age, in that environment, hot Mediterranean water, you're not really expecting to find anything like ship's timbers, and certainly not remains. But you are expecting to find the cargo of that ship, bronzes, marbles, etc. But unexpectedly, we found this. This is about 3 meters below the seabed. We dig down with a hydraulic water dredge, so this is not like an airlift. It very, very slowly sifts away the sediment, a lot of hand fanning to bring it up. And in looking for remaining pieces of the bronzes, ideally some remaining pieces of the Antikythera mechanism, a very early astrolabe, we came across this and stopped immediately. The project then flew a DNA specialist from Germany. We recovered these remains. He brought micro drills, drilled into this, returned them back to his laboratory, and we actually got a complete DNA strain from these 200 BC remains on board this Antikythera ship. The reason for including this one in my talk is that led on to the next projects that we got involved with directly because of experience of the team of handling human remains and DNA. If any of you have dived on the island of Vis in Croatia, it's a very popular dive site, but there are a lot of wrecks around it. And uniquely, there are a great deal of aircraft wrecks. The reason the island of Vis is so important for aircraft wrecks is in the latter part of the war, once North Africa had fallen, Sicily had been taken, and then southern Italy, we were flying bombing missions from the south up to Ploiești to the oil refineries in Romania, and on the return run, hopefully the aircraft would land back at their home airfields. Vis was under the power of Tito, so it was kind of semi-neutral under the partisans. So there was a small runway on Vis, but it was designed for a Spitfire squadron, single-engine fighters, not for 4-engine heavy bombers. But when they were damaged from flak or fighters over the bomb site, they would attempt a controlled crash landing on that runway. And many times, as the photo on the left, they crashed, the bulldozers would push them out of the way so the next damaged plane could come in for their turn at a controlled crash. Because of this delay, many of them didn't make it onto the runway. They ditched into the sea. The B-24 Tulsa American, named after the town in which it was made, paid for by the workers of the factory from their own wages. Every worker signed this aircraft. And this didn't make it onto the runway. It crashed into the sea. A couple of images of it here. You can see here the 50 caliber gun of the waist gun position on the starboard side of the aircraft. Interesting thing, these were high altitude bombing runs, way above the hypoxic level in freezing conditions, and there were no windows in these waist guns. The aircraft were not pressurized. The guys were wearing heated suits, like we now use from Santee. They were wearing oxygen masks. They were plugged into a main oxygen system of the aircraft. If they needed to move around, they had small carry bottles to move to the next plug-in station. This schematic shows all those positions. The position you see there is that one particular waist gun. One of the perks of the job is in research, we managed to get flown out to America to fly in the last airworthy B-24. And when they landed after the flight, I'm over Boca Raton in Florida here at very low altitude, so it's pretty warm and not hypoxic. But there you could really appreciate the wind and the cold and what these guys went through. So we were able to get a lot of knowledge because when we landed from the flight, they allowed us to crawl around the whole inside of the aircraft, take out all the panels, empty all the boxes, and really learn what we were looking at. This enabled us to search better once we got onto the wreck. This is a mosaic of the site. It's regularly dived by recreational divers. She sits in 40 meters of water on a small seamount, with the exception of the tail, which sits at around 60 meters of water off the seamount. What happens with a B-24 is bomb bay is made of shutter slats, like a blind on a window. Comes down and shuts, the bomb bay is then sealed to a degree, non-pressurized of course. When a B-24 hits the water, those shutter slat bomb bay doors are very fragile, so they're ripped off instantaneously. The impact to the ocean then rushes through the open bomb bay straight towards the tail and pulls the whole rear end off. What that causes is the front section, including the wings and cockpit, immediately flip over and then both halves sink, pointing at each other. Kind of bizarre, but just about every B-24 you'll dive is in that configuration. All of these aircraft that went down received what's called a MACA, a Missing Air Crew Report. And those are held now by the DPAA, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. And they prioritize aircraft that have known fallen veterans on board for excavation tasks to try and return those veterans to their families for military and private burial to bring every man home. What you see on the left-hand picture is a close-up of the nose gun turret, the cockpit, and two of the engines, the two inner engines. What we knew from the MACA, witness reports of the fishermen that rowed out to get the guys that survived that were in the water. 2 were seen to be thrown clear of the wreckage as it hit. 3 were missing. So from that data, it was likely there was a possibility to find 1 inside the wreck, very unlikely that the 2 were thrown clear would be. A team of recreational divers from Croatia some years prior had actually lifted up this section with a lift bag, not to surface, but lifted enough to get to the engine identification plate underneath, so prove that this was Tulsa American. When you dive these, none of the insignia or anything like that are left remaining. So because they knew it was Tulsa American, because they were certain there were 3 MIA, it justified the budget of a search team. So Brendan Foley, who I'd worked with at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute on the Antikythera project, was sent out to JPAC in Hawaii, DPAA's laboratories, and made an SRE, site recording expert, because of his human remains background, and we were sent to look for the fallen aircrew. This is a systematic archaeological excavation, not a random search. So we built a grid. It's made out of plastic pipe, bolted together. The advantage of that is it's very simple to tow it around with the SUEX. So as you finish each grid, you can move. We excavate each square one at a time. We're using a hydraulic dredge. So you have hydraulic pipes from a motor on the boat deck down to around 20 meters. You then have fire hose from that pump impeller down to seabed. That goes round a dredge venturi that creates a delicate amount of suction and an enormous mess. So visibility is reduced to terrible at the end of the dredge. But what you're after is you cannot afford to lose any component, anything that is found, from the smallest button to the smallest bone fragment or osseous remain. So we have a 1 cubic meter box with a mesh over the top of it. The outflow of the dredge goes into that, and every single piece of remain is brought to the surface and sifted through. So this went on for about a month and a half, and we covered all of these grid squares, starting in the nexus area where we thought we most likely would find the missing. 2 thrown ashore, as I'd said, but basically we were looking mostly in this grid here between these 2 engines. What we're looking for is something like this, for example. We excavate down until the last thing found is noted, and then you get a DPAA specified distance of sterile ground underneath it. Then that square is closed. The size of mesh that you have to sift into is specified by DPAA as well. So site is searched to their specification. And as you move away to surface sediment, things start to appear. So this is a parachute. Now, it's not necessarily somebody's parachute because many spares were carried, but there was 1 per crew. This one was actually under the engine, stuffed under the wing. They're made of silk at this point. And so we basically box this up, move it to one side. You have material evidence, which is basically non-human. Then you have osseous remains, which is human. That 1 cubic meter of sediment was brought to surface. We were kind of luxuriant in our dive boat. The Croatian Navy loaned us a tank landing craft. It's pretty special when the beach you walk to work in is the front door of a landing craft. You walk down it till you're this deep, put your fins on and drop off the end down to your wreck site on a 3-point mooring. But having the crane meant that we could lift the bag with no risk of it billowing from using lift bags, get it on deck. Then we had a conveyor belt system, a hose pipe, archaeological sieves, and the team spent their afternoons in this metal box in the sun sifting through a ton of sediment. But well worth the effort because you can't spot everything by eye that goes into the dredge, especially when the working conditions have become zero visibility. So it gets pretty personal when you start finding things like this. These flight wings were not any of the fallen. They were just lost amongst the wreckage from one of the survivors. This is a life vest known as a Mae West by the pilots that was found on site. And this was the wedding band. Now, this particular MACA is a concluded site, so a public announcement of the person found was made. But we knew from the data of the 3 people missing that only 1 was married. So when we found this, we knew we were in the area of exactly the person we were looking for. It's bringing shivers to my arms even now, and this was in 2017. When you find something that personal, it really means a great deal. This is slightly different. It's another wreck on Viz, and it's B-17. This is not our B-17, but it is an absolute mirror image of what happened to our B-17. It hasn't been pulled in half. Bomb bay doors are solid metal. So B-17 is a beautiful, sleek aircraft. It's a stunning thing to look at. The Tulsa American and other B-24 were jokingly called the ugly box that nice airplanes were delivered in. But they were like the Liberty ship. They were built in their thousands and rapidly to service needs. Further range, bigger bomb capacity. But these things are absolutely slick. Sadly, didn't get to fly in one of these. But what happens often with a B-17, in reasonably calm conditions that does a sea landing, it can land fairly securely, almost like a seaplane, but then sink. So our B-17, no name, unlike Tulsa American, it was her maiden flight. Delivered to Foggia, southern Italy, ready for its first bombing run, got hydraulic system damage from flak over Plower-Street, didn't make it onto the Viz runway because the runway was blocked by a previous crashed aircraft and hit the sea. Little life raft. The life rafts are situated forward of the top turret, just behind the cockpit in 2 bays. So on the B-17 in Croatia, you can see into those bays that the life rafts are gone, and the guys were able to row back into shore. Everyone survived except for 1 person who died over the bombing run. A piece of flak went through the aircraft, through the seat, and through him. So he was lifted out of his seat by his crew. He was carried downstairs to get him out of the way so the operation could continue. And there's a wooden crawlway that goes into the forward gun turret, and he was laid on that. When they crashed in the sea, there wasn't time to remove him. So this is a very unique Mecca. You knew exactly where you were going. Some of you might have dived this site. What interests me, and the reason behind some of the philosophy of this talk, is that with this, hundreds, thousands of recreational divers dive this, and nobody really knows or knew, because not a lot of times the briefing includes this, that basically this is the cockpit, this is the astronavigation dome, bent forward turret, roof turret here, and he was under the cockpit, approximately 5 meters of penetration in through this little dark hole at the front. Covered by the requirements of the Croatian Ministry of Culture, we're not allowed to damage the site at all. We can move things. So we had to penetrate through that little hole. And linked to yesterday's talk, 30 minutes of bottom time on this wreck, 2.5 hours of deco, that's our canister duration, 2 teams running each day. So very unproductive from a man-hours point of view. Park a Sentinel next to this thing, or similar ones. Around Croatia, there are loads in the 90, 100, 150 meter range. Makes a big difference on the productivity. But the recovery project here was different. All that apparatus from the previous slides, I had to crawl in through this hole, work my way up through, leaving one bailout stage outside because it wouldn't fit, one with me, into the area where we knew he would be on that crawlway. Guys would feed the dredge into me, and fire it up, and then be in 0 visibility. And it was so bad that my JJ HUD I took out of the bracket and duct taped it to the mask so I could monitor my PO2. And you were literally just feeling through the sediment, recovering artifacts by touch, putting it in a bag, working out, and again, covering all the sediment to surface for sieving afterwards. Lots of stuff came out of this because you're deep inside the wreck. Beyond normal penetration, you side mount divers, lots of them tried to swim through the wreck. The bomb bay was a bit cluttered, but you're getting pilot masks, you're getting May Wests, you're getting little waterproof boxes of matches with a compass in the lid. One thing that's not on this photo was a personal morphine ampoule, which was on the harness of every crew member, which was another personal touch. But these are the interesting ones, because just to make the 0 vis even worse, these are sea dive packs. The aircraft goes down in the sea, you break the tab, the whole sea turns green so the helicopter can find you. Or my whole world turns green as the bag bursts I've just sucked through the dredge and covers me in this kind of green goop. And there's the release tab on there. So basically quite interesting things to see and find. This is why we do this. Lieutenant Eugene Ford was found on Tulsa American. He was returned. He had military honors burial at Arlington. He then went to his family churchyard and was buried by his family. His granddaughter wore that wedding ring at the funeral that we sent back to her. And then Ernest Vignew was on the B-17. His family took the time to write a handwritten letter to every member of the team that was involved in his recovery. And that is the reason for it, the respect of the fallen, because these sites that we love to dive are also somebody's grave. Sammy and Jenny have left, sadly. They were here yesterday, but with Tomek Sakura from Santi, we were invited as the international contingent to join a big Polish dive team, the Baltic Tech dive team, to go out and dive the Karlsruhe. It took Tomek and his team a very long time to find it. So here we have the scans they took with side scan, overlaid on the photos of the Karlsruhe, to start to realize that maybe the shape of this wreck they found is potentially Karlsruhe. A team of archaeologists from the museum and history came out. We were very lucky to be donated a commercial DSV with a moon pool to dive on this site. It's in 90 meters of water. We headed out to have a look and dive it. Now, you'll notice here there's other wrecks, and many of you may have heard of this Willem Gustaf, Operation Hannibal. The greatest loss of life on any shipwreck, over 10,000 people on board. Karlsruhe is a tiny ship. 1,000 people on this when she went down. Refugees. These were people fleeing from the Red Army, getting in as many boats as they can. Karlsruhe was even towing a sail ship with more people on board. Halfway across, torpedoed, freezing cold Baltic Sea in the winter. The loss of life was horrific. Tomek's book, Road of Death, is definitely worth a read if you can get a copy. And Drain the Oceans did a documentary on this project, but really haunting. As you saw yesterday, some of Becky's photos and Pete's photos, when you dive these cold water places like the Great Lakes and the Baltic, the preservation of what's down there is amazing. It's just nothing is degraded. Here's 2 sites. Is that the Karlsruhe? We had to go to find out. And the other ship that she was towing, first day we dived this, just as a quick recon to see if we could work out what it was. The rest of the project, we were so blessed. This is the Baltic Sea. We were out on a 4-point morning on a DSV with a moon pool on glass flat sea for the entire 2 weeks. So somebody was smiling of us, wanted us to find it. This is my buddy, Oskar Svensson, works for Reel in Sweden. He's an amazing diver, my friend that I dive with in the Swedish mines on our deep project. And he has got a wire brush there that he used to scrape away all the marine growth after we'd cut away the shroud of ghost net and slowly to reel the letters. The archaeologists were a bit skeptical. It's an R. There's an R in Karlsruhe, but what about the rest? So day by day, we scrubbed away more and more and more until we finally got proof that this was Karlsruhe. And then big planning sessions with the archaeologists, with the museum, as to what we could look at and find to deal with this situation next. Here we have one of the many, many chests inside. They authorized the lifting of one case. You might be wondering, I'm getting pretty close, so I won't take too much longer. You may be wondering why we were lifting this. It is believed that on board Karlsruhe was a thing called the Amber Room. If you've not heard of it, basically it is literally a carved room of amber. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, the furniture, everything. When the war started to turn in direction, it was believed it was packed up in boxes, stolen and shipped out, a bit like that movie Monuments Men. So we lifted this as one test crate with the museum's position to see if it was full of amber. It wasn't, it was full of radio equipment. Still pretty impressive. What's haunting about this wreck, because the refugees are on the surface, when you dive it, we did several circuits to see if anything had fallen off, and the remains are all around the outside of the wreck, preserved because of the cold anoxic water. So a wreath was laid to the fallen as part of the ceremony at sunset one day off this beautiful vessel that we were loaned to do the dive. Again, brings it home, makes it very haunting. My last few slides, sorry I'm a couple of minutes over. HMS Hampshire, very famous because of who was on board. You've seen that poster from First World War of the man with the enormous moustache, very British, going, "Your country needs you." That's Lord Kitchener of Khartoum. Lord Kitchener was on a secret mission to Archangel in Russia to negotiate with the Russians to aid us in the First World War. They came out of Scapa Flow, the naval base that's a famous dive site now, in a massive storm, went round the islands to the west, hit a mine off Mullen Point, and basically went down with up to 700 lives lost. So here's a scan of the site, and this is the sort of personal remains you're finding on site. This is the stoker's room in the boiler rooms. The shovels, gloves, fire hoses. Those guys would have been shoveling coal constantly as this big ship went off around the site. This is Lord Kitchener. The memorial to him was made on the headland. Back in the day, only the wealthy were remembered. But this now is a slate wall that goes all the way around the memorial overlooking the wreck site with every name of every member of the fallen on board. This is a restricted site, cannot be dived. It's a British military war grave. We dived it under permit to survey it for baseline, see how it's degrading over the years. What's really, really haunting is those that were found washed up on shore had these simple metal markers made. Commonwealth graves have now replaced those with proper headstones, but from a crew of over 700, these are the ones that were recovered. So the rest lie on the wreck, along with Lord Kitchener and his staff. One final slide. Lawrence Binion wrote the poem that pretty much sums up how we should treat our veterans. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. And across the world, we do that through organisations like the Royal British Legion, the DPAA, and the Commonwealth War Graves. Sorry I ran over a bit, but thank you very much.